The SR-71 Blackbird was not just an airplane. It was a statement, a declaration, a machine that redefined what was possible in the realm of aviation and espionage. When it first took to the skies in the 1960s, it didn't just push boundaries, it obliterated them. Flying at altitudes where the sky turns black and the curvature of the Earth becomes visible, traveling at speeds that turned physics into a weapon, the Blackbird represented something the Soviet Union had never encountered before. An adversary they could see coming but could never stop. This was not a stealth aircraft. The Blackbird didn't hide. It didn't need to. Soviet radar operators watched it appear on their screens, tracked its trajectory, calculated its speed and altitude, and then did the only thing they could do, watch it disappear beyond their reach. Every detection was a reminder of their impotence. Every sighting was a humiliation. The SR-71 didn't sneak past Soviet defenses. It announced itself, performed its mission, and departed with absolute impunity. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, the Soviet Union could do about it. To understand why the Blackbird terrified the Soviets, you must first understand what it represented. This was the height of the Cold War, an era defined by mutual suspicion, technological competition, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. Both superpowers poured enormous resources into military technology, each trying to gain even the slightest advantage. The Soviet Union had built one of the most formidable air defense networks in human history. Thousands of radar installations blanketed their territory. Hundreds of surface-to-air missile batteries stood ready. Elite interceptor squadrons trained relentlessly to defend Soviet airspace. This network was designed with one purpose, to make Soviet territory impenetrable to American aircraft. And then the Blackbird arrived and rendered all of it obsolete. The SR-71 operated in a realm that Soviet defenses simply couldn't reach. Cruising at altitudes exceeding 80,000 feet and speeds surpassing Mach 3.2, it existed in a dimension of flight that defied conventional interception. At those altitudes, the air is so thin that normal aircraft cannot generate enough lift. At those speeds, the friction between the aircraft and the atmosphere generates temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt conventional materials. The Blackbird was built from titanium, much of it ironically purchased from the Soviet Union through shell companies, and it leaked fuel on the ground because its panels only sealed properly when heated during flight. This was not just engineering excellence. This was engineering audacity. Soviet air defense commanders faced an impossible problem. Their radar systems could detect the Blackbird. That was never the issue. The problem was what came next. Detecting a target is meaningless if you cannot engage it. And engaging the SR-71 proved to be an exercise in futility that played out hundreds of times throughout the Cold War. Soviet operators would track the Blackbird as it approached their airspace, sometimes along the borders, sometimes, during its most daring missions, penetrating deep into Soviet territory. They would calculate firing solutions, they would launch missiles, and they would watch those missiles fail. The Soviets fired over 1,000 surface-to-air missiles at SR-71 aircraft during the Cold War. The exact number remains classified, but various sources suggest the count exceeded 1,000 attempts. Not a single one ever achieved a hit. Not one. This wasn't due to lack of effort or inferior technology in all respects. Soviet missile systems were sophisticated and deadly. They had successfully shot down American U-2 spy planes, most famously when Francis Gary Powers was brought down in 1960. But the U-2 flew at 60,000 feet and subsonic speeds. The SR-71 operated in an entirely different realm. Consider the mathematics of interception. A surface-to-air missile must not only reach the altitude of its target, but must do so while the target is still within range. The SR-71 traveled at roughly 1 mile per second. In the time it took a missile to climb to 80,000 feet, the Blackbird had already traveled miles beyond the missile's engagement envelope. Soviet missiles like the S-75 Divina, the system that downed Powers, had a maximum altitude of around 60,000 feet, 20,000 feet short of the Blackbird's cruising altitude. Later systems like the S-200 could theoretically reach higher, but they faced the same fundamental problem. The SR-71 was simply too fast. By the time a missile arrived at the intercept point, the Blackbird was already gone. But missiles were only one part of the Soviet response. They also deployed interceptor aircraft, and this is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Soviet Union developed the MiG-25 Foxbat specifically as a counter to high-speed American threats. The Foxbat was an extraordinary machine in its own right, capable of reaching Mach 2.8 and climbing to altitudes above 70,000 feet. It was one of the fastest operational fighters ever built. Soviet pilots trained extensively in intercept procedures, practicing the precise maneuvers required to close with a high-altitude, high-speed target. And yet, they never succeeded. The problem was endurance and performance envelope. The MiG-25 could reach Mach 2.8, but only in short bursts. At maximum speed, its engines operated at temperatures that risked catastrophic failure. Pilots were instructed to limit time at maximum speed to avoid destroying their aircraft. The Foxbat could reach high speeds, but it couldn't sustain them. The SR-71, by contrast, cruised at Mach 3.2 for hours. This wasn't a sprint capability. It was standard operating procedure. The Blackbird's sustained speed advantage meant that even if a MiG-25 achieved an optimal intercept position, it couldn't maintain it long enough to employ weapons. There were documented cases of MiG-25s attempting intercepts of SR-71s. Soviet pilots would scramble, light their afterburners, and climb desperately toward the Blackbird's altitude. Sometimes they achieved radar lock. Sometimes they even got close enough to see the distinctive black shape against the darkness of the upper atmosphere. But close enough to see is not close enough to shoot, and the Blackbird's speed always carried it beyond the engagement envelope before weapons could be employed. Soviet pilots reported the frustration of watching the SR-71 pull away, accelerating into the distance while their own aircraft shuddered at the limits of its performance. Some accounts suggest that Soviet pilots did manage to fire air-to-air missiles at the Blackbird on at least a few occasions. None achieved hits. The combination of altitude, speed, and the SR-71's defensive systems made successful engagement virtually impossible. The Blackbird carried electronic countermeasures, and in later years could detect missile launches and adjust its flight profile accordingly. But often, such maneuvers weren't even necessary. The aircraft's sheer performance was defense enough. This brings us to the deeper reason the SR-71 terrified the Soviet Union. It wasn't just that they couldn't stop it. It was what it was doing while they couldn't stop it. The Blackbird wasn't just flying over Soviet territory for sport. It was collecting intelligence, vast amounts of intelligence. The SR-71 carried camera systems of breathtaking sophistication, capable of photographing 100,000 square miles of Earth's surface per hour. The resolution was extraordinary. Analysts could identify vehicle types, red markings on aircraft, and assess the status of military installations from the edge of space. Every time the Blackbird flew a mission along Soviet borders, or during its most aggressive operational periods, over Soviet territory, it was mapping military capabilities. Missile sites, airfields, naval bases, troop concentrations, nuclear facilities, manufacturing centers. The Soviet Union invested enormous resources in concealment and deception, but none of it mattered when an aircraft could photograph entire regions from altitudes where interception was impossible. The Blackbird saw everything, and the Soviets knew it was seeing everything, and they knew they couldn't stop it. This created a psychological dimension to the terror. Soviet military planners had to operate under the assumption that their dispositions were known. Their secrets were not secret. Their hidden installations were not hidden. American intelligence could track the deployment of new missile systems, the construction of new air bases, the movement of armored divisions. This intelligence advantage had profound strategic implications. In a potential conflict, the United States would know where Soviet assets were located. Soviet surprise attacks became far more difficult to execute when the enemy could photograph your preparations from 80,000 feet. The Soviet response was to pour resources into countermeasures. They developed new radar systems with better high-altitude tracking capabilities. They upgraded their missiles, seeking greater range and speed. They improved their interceptors. They invested in electronic warfare systems designed to jam or deceive the Blackbird's sensors. Billions of rubles flowed into programs aimed at solving the SR-71 problem. And yet, throughout the entire operational life of the Blackbird, the fundamental equation never changed. The Soviets could detect it, they could track it, they could fire at it, but they could never hit it. There's a particular incident that captures the relationship between the Blackbird and Soviet defenses. In the 1980s, during a mission along the Soviet border, an SR-71 crew detected multiple missile launches. Soviet operators had fired a salvo of surface-to-air missiles in an attempt to bracket the aircraft's flight path. The standard evasive procedure for the Blackbird wasn't to turn or dive. It was to accelerate. The pilot pushed the throttles forward, and the aircraft accelerated beyond Mach 3.2, simply outrunning the missiles. The crew watched the missiles on their sensors, tracked their trajectories, and noted when they fell away, unable to close the distance. Then they continued their mission. This was routine. The technological sophistication of the SR-71 cannot be overstated. This was an aircraft designed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, yet it incorporated solutions to problems that wouldn't become common in aviation for decades. The titanium construction, necessary to withstand the heat of sustained Mach 3 flight. The special fuel, JP7, which had an extraordinarily high flash point and served double duty as hydraulic fluid and coolant. The inlet cones that adjusted automatically to manage airflow into the engines at different speeds. The reconnaissance systems that could operate in the thin atmosphere and extreme cold of the stratosphere. Every system on the Blackbird was purpose-built for an operating environment that no other aircraft could survive. And the Soviets knew all of this. They studied the Blackbird intensely. When they could, they collected telemetry data from its flights. They analyzed photographs of the aircraft. They debriefed their pilots who had attempted intercepts. They understood, probably better than most Americans, just how remarkable the SR-71 was, and that understanding only deepened their frustration and fear. This wasn't a gap they could close through incremental improvements. The Blackbird represented a quantum leap in capability, and matching it would require fundamental breakthroughs in multiple technologies simultaneously. Some Soviet engineers proposed exotic solutions. Anti-satellite weapons that might be adapted to target high-altitude aircraft. Long-range missiles with nuclear warheads that could destroy targets through proximity rather than direct hits. Advanced directed energy weapons. Some of these concepts were explored, but none reached operational status during the Blackbird's service life. The SR-71 remained untouchable. The Blackbird's operational history spans from 1966 to 1998, though its most active years were during the height of the Cold War in the 1970s and 1980s. During this period, it flew thousands of missions, many of them in areas where Soviet defenses were most concentrated. It operated over the Middle East, photographing Soviet equipment and advisors. It flew missions monitoring Soviet naval activities. It tracked missile tests and nuclear developments, and through all of this, despite constant attempts at interception, it never lost an aircraft to enemy action. The psychological impact on Soviet military leadership was profound. They had built their entire defensive strategy around the ability to control their airspace. The existence of an aircraft they could not stop undermined that strategy at its foundation. It forced them to divert resources to countermeasures that never worked. It created doubt about their technological capabilities. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that in at least one crucial dimension of the Cold War competition, the United States had achieved clear superiority. When the SR-71 was finally retired in 1998, it wasn't because adversaries had found a way to counter it. It was because satellites and other intelligence-gathering methods had become more cost-effective. The Blackbird could still fly missions that nothing else could match, but the strategic calculus had changed. The aircraft's retirement was a choice, not a necessity imposed by enemy capabilities. To this day, no aircraft has matched what the SR-71 achieved. Modern fighters are faster in some regimes, but none can sustain Mach 3+ speeds for hours. Reconnaissance satellites provide global coverage, but they follow predictable orbits. Drones offer persistence, but not at the Blackbird's speed or altitude. The SR-71 occupied a unique niche in aviation history, a combination of capabilities that has never been replicated. For the Soviet Union, the Blackbird was more than just a reconnaissance aircraft. It was a symbol of American technological prowess. It was a daily reminder of vulnerability. It was proof that despite their vast resources and scientific talent, they had been beaten in a crucial dimension of the Cold War. Soviet radar operators spent decades watching the Blackbird appear on their screens, knowing they were witnessing something they could not stop. Soviet missile crews fired countless weapons at a target they would never hit. Soviet pilots pushed their aircraft to the edge of destruction, chasing an adversary they could never catch. The SR-71 Blackbird terrified the Soviet Union because it was unstoppable, because it saw everything, because it proved that in the realm of high-altitude, high-speed reconnaissance, American engineering had created something beyond Soviet reach, and because, despite decades of effort and billions in investment, that equation never changed. The Blackbird flew its missions, collected its intelligence, and returned home, every single time, and there was nothing the Soviet Union could do but watch.